Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another deep dive here on Book Summary Podcast. Today, we're tackling a problem that I think just about everyone listening can relate to,
Yeah,
anxiety.
it's rough.
And to help us navigate this all too familiar feeling, we're diving into Max Lucado's Anxious for Nothing. If you're constantly feeling like worry is running your life, hit that subscribe button because this deep dive is for you.
Yeah, definitely.
Think about it. How often do you find yourself stressing about things that might happen or replaying past mistakes?
Oh, all the time.
It's exhausting, right?
Yeah,
I know I'm guilty of it.
for sure.
And apparently, a lot of people are searching for ways to break free from this cycle.
Yeah,
Did you know that Philippians 4.67, the verse that tells us be anxious for nothing,
right.
is the most highlighted passage in the entire Bible on Kindle?
Uh,
Clearly, we could all use a little more calm in our lives.
yeah, I think that's pretty spot on.
So let's see what Lucado has to offer.
Okay.
He kicks things off by really defining what anxiety is and how it's different from fear. I found that pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, it's a crucial distinction.
Okay.
Fear is that immediate jolt you get when you're facing a real present danger.
Right.
Like, you know you're hiking and suddenly come face to face with a bear.
Right.
Your heart pounds, your adrenaline spikes. That's fear.
Yeah.
It's designed to protect you.
Makes sense.
But anxiety
Right.
is more like a low hum in the background, constantly reminding you of all the things that could go wrong,
Oh, yeah.
even if they're not actually happening.
Oh, for sure.
It's that what-if storm that just never seems to let up.
Lucado calls it a meteor shower of what-ifs,
That's a good one.
which I thought was such a brilliant image.
Yeah.
It really captures that feeling of being bombarded by worries
Yeah,
and how draining it can be.
for sure.
It's like you're constantly bracing for impact,
Yeah,
even when there's no real threat on the horizon.
exactly.
So what do we do about this constant barrage of worries? Thankfully, Lucado doesn't just leave us hanging. He outlines a four-step approach he calls calm.
Okay, I like it.
Celebrate, ask, leave, meditate.
Yeah.
And the best part is it's all based on Philippians 4.48.
Okay.
So it's not just some self-help gimmick.
Right.
It's grounded in something deeper.
Love it.
Let's break those steps down.
Okay.
I'm actually really curious about this first one. Celebrate.
Okay.
It seems counterintuitive when you're feeling anxious.
Oh,
Right?
yeah.
Like, how am I supposed to celebrate when I'm freaking out about my presentation tomorrow or whether I paid the electric bill?
It's about intentionally shifting your focus. Instead of dwelling on all the things that are wrong
Okay.
or could go wrong, you choose to acknowledge the good things in your life.
Mm-hmm.
You celebrate the blessings, big and small.
Right.
And even more than that, you celebrate God's goodness, his faithfulness, his love.
So it's not just about ignoring the negative stuff. It's about actively replacing it with positive things.
Exactly. And this is where understanding God's sovereignty comes in.
Okay.
One of the biggest drivers of anxiety is this feeling of being out of control. But when we truly grasp that God is in control, that he's got this whole universe in his hands,
Right.
well, it changes the game.
That's
Yes.
like when you're stressed about work deadlines and your to-do list feels a mile long. But if you can pause and remember that ultimately God is in control, it can help you approach those tasks with a little more peace,
For sure.
knowing that you're not in this alone.
Absolutely.
But if you're finding this helpful so far, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the rest of this deep dive. We'll be back to unpack the other steps of calm after a quick break.
Actually, there's no break. We'll jump right into the next step. Ask.
Oh, that's right. No breaks on the deep dive.
Yeah.
So ask that one seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
Just pray about whatever's stressing you out.
It's more than just firing off a quick prayer. It's about acknowledging your need for God's help
Right.
and recognizing that he is big enough to handle whatever you're facing. Lucado talked about how prayer isn't about twisting God's arm to get what we want. It's about aligning our hearts with his will.
So it's about surrendering control even in the midst of our anxieties.
Absolutely. And that leads us to the third step. Leave.
Leave.
Once we've poured out our hearts to God, we need to leave those concerns with him.
Okay.
Not easy.
Wait, so saying God has a plan is different from providence how?
Oh, good question.
I feel like I hear those phrases interchangeably,
Yeah.
but you're saying there's more to it.
You're right. It's a subtle difference, but it's important. Saying God has a plan can sometimes feel passive, like he set things in motion and then stepped back.
I see.
But providence is about God actively working through all circumstances,
Okay.
even the bad ones,
Right.
to bring about good.
So it's not just that he has a blueprint.
Yeah.
It's that he's actively building, shaping, even redirecting things as leader.
Exactly. It's like He's in the control tower, constantly monitoring the radar, making adjustments to ensure the plane lands safely, even when there's turbulence. And to illustrate this, Lucado points to the life of Joseph.
Oh, yeah. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused, thrown in prison.
Right?
Talk about a rough life.
Yeah.
But in the end, he rises to power and saves countless lives.
He does.
A pretty dramatic example of how God can work through even the most difficult situations.
It really is. And the key phrase in Joseph's story is, but God. Like, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good.
Oh, yeah.
It's such a powerful reminder that God can turn even the most heartbreaking situations around. He's not just watching from a distance.
Right.
He's actively involved in our lives.
That's where it gets really interesting, because it's not just about our personal struggles. Lucado connects this idea of providence to the crucifixion of Jesus. Think about it.
Right.
The death of Jesus seems like the ultimate defeat at the time, right?
Definitely seemed that way.
But God used that very event,
Right.
the most horrific act of evil,
Yeah.
to bring about the greatest good,
Yeah.
the salvation of humanity.
It's mind-blowing when you really stop to think about it. And it shows us that even when things seem dark and hopeless, God is still working. He's still in control. And he can use even the most painful experiences for good.
Okay, that's heavy stuff. But it's also incredibly encouraging. I mean, if God can use something as terrible as the crucifixion for good, then what can't he bring good out of?
It makes you think.
And speaking of finding peace amidst chaos,
Oh, okay.
let's talk about the final step in Lucado's calm approach. Meditate.
I have to admit, when I first heard this, I pictured myself sitting on a mountaintop chanting Om.
Yeah, I get it.
But Lucado's talking about something a little different, isn't he?
He is. He's talking about intentionally filling our minds with things that are true, noble, right? Pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, or praiseworthy.
Whoa, that's a mouthful.
That's a lot.
It's about taking control of our thought life, because our thoughts have a powerful influence on how we feel and how we act.
Oh, for sure.
So instead of dwelling on the negative, the worries, the fears, the what-ifs, we intentionally choose to focus on things that are positive and uplifting. That's the idea. It's about starving those anxious thoughts by feeding our minds with truth. Lucado even gives some practical tips for doing this, like memorizing scripture,
Oh, that's good.
listening to uplifting music,
Nice.
spending time in nature, surrounding yourself with positive people.
So it's about creating an environment that nurtures peace, both internally and externally.
Exactly.
And you know what? This reminds me of time when,
Hold on, before you get into that, I think it's important to point out that Lucado doesn't just give us a bunch of feel-good platitudes. He dives deep into some specific issues that often fuel our anxiety,
okay.
starting with guilt.
Oh, right. Guilt. That's a big one.
Yeah.
And Lucado doesn't shy away from getting personal.
No, he doesn't.
He talks about his own struggles with guilt and
Mhm.
how it affected him for years.
Right.
It's a reminder that we've all messed up. We've all done things we regret.
Yeah.
And that unresolved guilt can really eat away at us.
He lists all these different ways we try to cope with guilt.
Oh, really?
Numbing it, denying it,
Yeah.
minimizing it,
Okay.
burying it, punishing ourselves. It's like we're trying to outrun our past, but it
Yeah.
always seems to catch up.
Speaking of hiding, Lucado says that guilt makes us want to hide from God too. Just like Adam and Eve did after they ate the forbidden fruit.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
We mess up and we feel this urge to distance ourselves from God, like we're not worthy of his love anymore.
But that's exactly what Satan wants us to believe. He wants us to isolate ourselves, to wallow in our guilt and shame. But Lucado reminds us that God isn't looking to condemn us. He's looking to redeem us. He offers us forgiveness and a fresh start.
And it's not just a one-time deal, right?
Yep.
This forgiveness is available to us every single day, no matter how many times we stumble.
Exactly. And the story of the Apostle Paul is such a powerful illustration of this. This man went from literally hunting down Christians to becoming one of the most devoted followers of Jesus.
Oh, wow.
Talk about a transformation.
It's mind-blowing, really.
Yeah.
And it shows us that no matter what we've done, no matter how far we've strayed, God's grace is bigger. It has the power to completely change our lives.
For sure.
Well, folks, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, and we're just getting started. If you're finding this helpful so far, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more insightful deep dives into books that can transform your life. We'll be back in part 2 to explore the power of God's grace and how it can set us free from anxiety.
You know, as we were talking about Paul's incredible transformation, it made me think about how often we try to earn our way back into God's good graces. When we mess up, it's like we think we have to be good enough before we can approach him.
That's so true. It's like we put this pressure on ourselves to be perfect, to have it all together before we feel worthy of his love. But Lucado reminds us that it's not about our performance, it's about his grace.
Exactly. He talks about how Paul realized that all his accomplishments, all his attempts at self-righteousness were meaningless compared to the gift of God's grace. There's this powerful quote from Philippians 3:7 where Paul says,
Okay.
"But whatever was to my profit, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ."
Wow, that's a pretty radical statement. He's basically saying that everything he'd strived for, everything he'd valued before encountering Christ, paled in comparison to the freedom he found in God's grace.
Yeah.
It's funny because reading that passage made me think about my own tendency to cling to control. Like, I'm a planner. I like to have things organized, predictable. But life rarely works out that way, does it?
Not at all. And that's where anxiety often creeps in. We try to control everything to make things go according to our plan. But when things inevitably veer off, of course we freak out.
That's me in a nutshell.
I get it.
But how do we let go of that need for control? Because it's easy to say trust God, but it's a lot harder to actually do it when you're in the thick of things.
Well, Lucado uses this beautiful analogy of a lace maker working in a dark room. She can only see a small section of the pattern illuminated by a single ray of light. It's intricate and detailed, but she can't see the full picture.
So she has to trust the pattern even though she can't see where it's going.
Exactly. And in the same way, we often only see a tiny snippet of our lives, the part that's right in front of us. We don't understand the big picture, the overall design that God is weaving. But just like the lace maker trusts the pattern, we can trust that God has a plan.
And that even when we don't understand what he's doing, we can have faith that he's working all things together for good. That's a powerful image. I really like that.
Yeah, it's a good one.
We're talking about these big concepts like sovereignty, grace, and providence, but sometimes it's hard to see how they play out in everyday life. Like, how does this actually help me deal with the stress of raising kids, paying bills, and juggling a million things at once?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that a lot of listeners are probably asking themselves. Like, Lucado doesn't just leave us with these abstract ideas. He gives us concrete examples of how people have applied these principles to their lives. He tells the story of Horatio Spafford, who lost his 4 daughters in a shipwreck.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I bet a lot of listeners can relate to Spafford's struggle to find peace after such a devastating loss. To lose not just 1 child, but 4.
Right. It's unimaginable.
It is, and yet in the midst of his grief, Spafford wrote the words to the hymn, "It is well with my soul." It's a testament to the power of faith to anchor us even in the darkest of storms.
That's incredible. And it makes me think about how we often try to outrun our pain to numb ourselves to difficult emotions. But Lucado is saying that true peace isn't about avoiding suffering, it's about finding God in the midst of it.
Right. It's about trusting that even when we don't understand, even when we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, God is still there. He's still working. And he can use even our deepest pain for good. So if we're constantly feeling anxious, maybe it's a sign that we need to examine what we're putting our trust in, or we're relying on our own strengths, our own understanding, our own ability to control things, or are we surrendering to a God who is bigger than our circumstances, who sees the full picture even when we can't?
That's a great point. And Lucado challenges us to consider where our thoughts are focused. Are we dwelling on the what-ifs and the if-onlys, or are we choosing to focus on God's faithfulness, his love, and his power to work all things for good? It's about shifting our mindset from fear to faith.
And that's where the CALL acronym comes back in, right?
Yeah.
Celebrate the good, ask God for help, leave your concerns with him, and meditate on things that are true and life-giving.
Exactly. It's a daily practice, a way of life, not just a quick fix for when we're feeling stressed. And this reminds me of something that happened to me a few years ago.
Oh, I love a good story. Let's hear it. But before that, if you're enjoying this deep dive into Anxious for Nothing, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more insightful summaries of books that can change your life.
Yes, definitely.
And now back to your story. What happened?
I was going through a really difficult time, a job loss, family illness, just a lot of things piling up all at once.
Yeah.
And I was drowning in anxiety. I felt like I was barely keeping my head above water.
I can relate to that feeling. It's like being caught in a riptide, and no matter how hard you try to swim, you just keep getting pulled further out to sea.
Exactly. And I remember reading Anxious for Nothing during that time, and it was like a lifeline. Lucado's words reminded me that I wasn't alone, that God was with me in the midst of the storm.
So how did you start applying the calm principles to your situation?
Well, the first step Celebrate was the hardest. It felt almost impossible to find anything to celebrate when everything seemed so dark.
Ooh.
But I started small. I made a list of things I was grateful for: my health, my family, the roof over my head.
It's amazing how powerful gratitude can be, isn't it?
It is.
Even when things are tough, there's always something to be thankful for.
Right. And as I started focusing on those things, my perspective began to shift. I started seeing glimpses of hope, where before there had only been despair. Then I moved on to ask. I poured out my heart to God, telling him all my fears and worries. I didn't hold anything back.
It's like releasing that pressure valve, isn't it?
Mhm.
Just admitting that we can't do this on our own, that we need his help.
It was incredibly freeing. And then came the hardest part: leave. It meant surrendering my anxieties to God, trusting that he had a plan, even though I couldn't see it. It wasn't easy, but I clung to the truth that he is good, he's faithful, and he loves me.
It sounds like you really embrace that concept of providence, that God is actively working through all circumstances, even the painful ones, to bring about good.
I did. And then came meditate. I started filling my mind with scripture, with uplifting music, with anything that would counter the negative thoughts swirling in my head. It was a daily battle, but slowly over time, those anxious thoughts began to lose their grip.
And what was the result? Did you start to feel more peace, more hope?
Absolutely. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but gradually I started to experience a deep sense of calm that I hadn't felt in months. It was like the storm clouds parted and the sun started to shine through.
That's so encouraging. And I think it's a testament to the power of Lucato's message. It's not just a bunch of theories, it's a practical roadmap for finding peace in the midst of life's storms. But speaking of storms, Lucato also tackles another big anxiety trigger, the feeling that we're not good enough, that we're falling short.
Right. And he doesn't sugarcoat it. He talks about how Satan, the enemy of our souls, is a master manipulator. He whispers doubts and fears, trying to undermine our faith and steal our peace.
It's like that little voice in our heads that constantly tells us we're not enough, not smart enough, not successful enough, not lovable enough. And it's exhausting, isn't it?
It is.
That constant striving to measure up, to prove our worth.
It is. And Lucato encourages us to counter those lies with the truth of God's word. He reminds us that we are loved, we are accepted, we are forgiven, not because of anything we've done, but because of who God is.
So it's about replacing those negative, self-defeating thoughts with God's truth.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of identity comes in. Who are we? Are we defined by our failures, our mistakes, our perceived shortcomings? Or are we defined by God's love, by his grace, by the fact that we are his beloved children?
That's a powerful shift in perspective. And it reminds me of that verse in Ephesians that says we are God's masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus for good works.
Exactly. And when we grasp that truth, when we see ourselves through God's eyes, it changes everything. It frees us from the need to perform, to strive, to constantly prove our worth.
Because our worth isn't based on our achievements or our accomplishments, it's based on the fact that we are loved by God unconditionally and eternally.
And that love is the foundation for true peace. It's the anchor that holds us steady in the midst of the storms. It's the source of our strength, our hope, and our resilience.
And speaking of resilience, Lucato also addresses the question of suffering. Because let's face it, life is hard. Bad things happen. And sometimes it feels like we're getting hit from all sides. How do we find peace when everything seems to be falling apart?
Well, Lucato acknowledges that suffering is a reality. He doesn't try to sugarcoat it or pretend it doesn't exist. But he also reminds us that we're not alone in our suffering. God is with us even in the darkest of valleys.
And that he can use even our pain for good if we allow him to.
Right. And that's where trust comes in. It's about choosing to believe that even when we don't understand, even when it hurts, God is still working. He's still in control, and he will bring us through it.
It's a choice we have to make every day, isn't it? To choose faith over fear, trust over doubt, hope over despair.
It is. And it's not always easy, but Lucato reminds us that we're not in this alone. We have God's grace, his strength, and his love to sustain us, and we have each other.
That's so important. We weren't meant to go through life alone.
Yeah.
We need community. We need support. We need people who will walk alongside us in the good times and the bad.
That's right.
Well, folks, we've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive. We've talked about the power of God's grace to free us from guilt and shame, the importance of surrendering our need for control, and the comfort of knowing that even in the midst of suffering, we are not alone. But before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore some practical tips for putting these principles into practice, I want to remind you to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss any of our future episodes. And if you're finding this deep dive helpful, please share it with your friends. We believe that everyone deserves to experience the peace and freedom that comes from knowing God. Welcome back to part 3 of our deep dive into Max Lucado's Anxious for Nothing. We've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff: guilt, suffering, surrendering, control.
Right.
But Lucado doesn't just leave us there wringing our hands in despair. He gives us practical tools to actually apply these concepts to our lives.
Yeah, that's one of the things I appreciate most about Lucado's approach. He doesn't just present these lofty theological ideas.
Right.
He makes them accessible, relatable.
Actionable.
And one of the most powerful tools he offers is this idea of trading turbulent thoughts for tranquil ones.
Okay, I like that.
It's about recognizing that our thoughts have a huge impact on how we feel and how we behave. So if we're constantly feeding our minds with worries and fears, it's no wonder we feel anxious.
You are what you eat, right?
Exactly.
Same thing with your mind.
So true. He challenges us to examine the things we're dwelling on,
Mhm.
those worries that just seem to take up permanent residence in our minds,
Right.
and to intentionally replace them with thoughts that are rooted in truth, hope, and God's promises.
I love that.
But how do we actually do that? Because it's one thing to say, think positive thoughts,
Yeah,
but it's a lot harder to actually make that shift when you're in the grip of anxiety.
for sure. Well, Lucado gives some really practical tips. He talks about the importance of memorizing scripture so that when those anxious thoughts come knocking,
Right.
you have God's truth readily available to combat them. He also suggests listening to uplifting music.
Spending time in nature, surrounding yourself with positive influences.
Right.
Anything that helps shift your focus from the negative to the positive.
So it's about creating an environment,
Mhm.
both internally and externally,
Yep,
that nurtures peace.
totally. It's like weeding your mental garden,
I love that.
pulling out the toxic thoughts and planting seeds of truth and hope.
But if we're being honest, sometimes it feels like those weeds just keep growing back no matter how hard we try to pull them up.
That's true. And Lucado acknowledges that this is an ongoing battle. It's not a one-time fix.
Right.
It's a daily choice to focus on God's truth over the lies that anxiety tries to feed us.
It really is. He actually uses this great analogy of taking every thought captive
Oh, yeah.
and making it obedient to Christ. It's like we're training our minds to recognize those unhealthy thought patterns and to redirect them towards truth.
Exactly. And it reminds me of that verse in Philippians 4:8 that says, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things."
It's a lot.
It's like Paul is giving us a checklist for mental decluttering.
I love that.
Mm.
And the amazing thing is when we start to make that shift,
Right.
when we intentionally focus on the good, the true, the beautiful,
Yep.
it actually changes how we feel.
Mm.
It's like we're replacing a soundtrack of fear and worry with a melody of peace and hope.
So true. And that peace isn't just for us. It spills over into our relationships, our work, our interactions with the world around us.
Oh, you see what you're saying?
We become beacons of hope, radiating a sense of calm and assurance that draws others to the source of our peace.
Because when you meet someone who genuinely radiates peace, it makes you want to know what their secret is, right?
Totally. It's contagious.
And ultimately, that's the goal, isn't it?
I think so.
To experience God's peace so profoundly that it transforms us from the inside out and inspires others to seek the same.
That's it.
And, as we wrap up this deep dive into Anxious for Nothing, I keep coming back to that quote from Lucado. Your anxiety decreases as your understanding of your Father increases. It's
Yeah.
so simple,
I love that one.
yet so profound.
Because at the root of anxiety is often a misunderstanding of who God is and how he operates.
That's true.
We forget that he is sovereign, that he is good,
Right.
that he loves us unconditionally.
And when we start to grasp those truths, when we experience his love for ourselves in a tangible way, it starts to chip away at the foundation of our anxiety. It's like the light of his love begins to chase away the shadows of fear and worry.
Beautiful imagery.
It's like trading a shaky makeshift bridge for a solid, unshakable foundation. When we build our lives on the truth of who God is, we can weather any storm.
Yeah, that's it.
So as we close out this episode, I want to challenge everyone listening to take some time to really reflect on their own relationship with God. Are you allowing yourself to experience his love fully? Are you trusting him with every aspect of your life? Because the more we understand him, the more we trust him, the less room there is for anxiety to take root.
I think that's a great challenge. And if you're struggling with anxiety, if those worries and fears feel overwhelming, remember that you're not alone. There's hope. There's help. Reach out to a trusted friend, a pastor, a counselor. And most importantly, reach out to God. He's waiting for you with open arms.
That's so good. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Anxious for Nothing, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this episode with anyone who might need a little more peace in their life. We're here to help you discover the freedom and joy that come from living a life anchored in God's love. So until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep diving deep. And most importantly, remember that you're not alone in this journey. We're all in this together.